Since Hine and Shattuck devote quite a bit of space discussing the rise of Tractarianism, which paralleled the evangelicalism of the Second Great Awakening in the Episcopal Church, I think it's necessary to say a bit about Roman Catholics in America before the Civil War. It is also important, I think, to introduce the Oxford movement and its consequences for those who haven't yet had the opportunity to study it in detail, although you'll have that opportunity again in the fall of 2014 when I'll be teaching my course, English Reformations, which has a large segment devoted to the Oxford movement. So in this lecture, I'll deal with Roman Catholics in America in the first part of the 19th century, and then in the next lecture I'll take up the Oxford movement. It was noted in the early lectures that Congregationalism and Anglicanism were the two established branches of Protestantism in the colony. If one includes Presbyterians, in 1775, 80% of Americans affiliated with a church that belonged to this religious bloc: Congregationalism, Anglicanism, Presbyterianism. All three of these denominations had strong ties to England. This week I've tried to document the rise in popularity and the growing membership among the United Methodists, a denomination that had English roots as well. But in the 19th century, so incredibly large was the flow of immigrants to these shores that by 1850, Roman Catholics, once a tiny and ignored minority, mostly congregated in Maryland and on the southern coast of the United States and what we would think of now as Louisiana. By 1850, Roman Catholicism had become the country's largest religious communion. And, for the most part, these immigrants were not English. Due to this shift in the nation's denominational equilibrium, America experienced the most violent period of religious discord in its entire history. You would hardly know that from the one sentence in Hine and Shattuck on page 71, where they note, in commenting on Charles McIlvaine's 1839 outcry against the first of the tracts for the Times published in the United States, that, quote, fears of Roman Catholicism peaked among American Protestants in the late 1830s and early 1840s. We need to allow ourselves here to indulge in a little bit of armchair sociology. The inner security of individuals rests upon a sense of group identity. Groups define themselves over and against other groups. People are also disturbed by rapid social change. When one of the transitional factors is a rapidly accelerating immigration rate, which disrupts established group relationships, a strong response is likely to ensue. Xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, or the fear of the other, is thus latent in almost every self-conscious people. Xenophobia is especially near the surface in a country that has only recently achieved national status. Xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, the fear of the other, is especially near the surface in a country that is engaged vigorously on many fronts in asserting its special character, its destiny, a character and a destiny embedded with religious terms. It has been the assumption of many that the United States had a responsibility to realize that destiny as a Protestant nation. That's important. I'll repeat it. It has been the assumption of many that the United States had a special responsibility to realize its destiny as a Protestant nation. Within the Roman Catholic Church itself, During this mass immigration, ethnic tension among immigrants fueled suspicion, distrust, and intolerance. Americans beheld a bitter struggle between French and Irish and German Roman Catholics. Emotional revivalism, which I talked about in the first two lectures, intensified Protestant revulsion at the wave of Roman Catholic immigrants. Anti-Catholicism offered a motive for Protestant solidarity and reunion. Local, state, and later even national politics became involved. By the 1830s and 40s, as Hine and Shattuck note, anti-Roman Catholicism gave rise to a sort of Protestant nativism. Nativism is a technical term. It means that to be an American, to be a true American, was to be a Protestant born on American soil. That nativism permeated the 1830s and 1840s. It gave rise to a brood of magazines, not the least of which was one called The Protestant Vindicator. It also gave rise to a genre of horror literature with salacious, lurid stories of Catholic atrocities, particularly about Catholic convents, about the abuses of Catholic clergy, things that went back to the early anti-Semitism in the Christian church as a counterpart for just how awful it could be. And violence soon followed. In August 1834, an Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which was home to a successful girls' school, was torched. And while the nation was initially shocked by that event, with a flood of laments and disclaimers following, the arsonists who were arrested were tried and acquitted, and in the minds of some, they became municipal heroes. Fears of Roman Catholicism had certainly peaked, which is why the Catholic movement in the Protestant Episcopal Church, why Tractarianism, was greeted with such suspicion among other Episcopalians, particularly Episcopalians of an evangelical stripe. And so in my next lecture, I want to turn my attention to the particulars of the Oxford movement to see just how that movement caught on in the United States and why it was greeted in some quarters of the Episcopal Church with such suspicion.